54 years, lighting up the sky. A quivering leap smashes a billion worlds. Ha! Entire body looks for nothing. Living, I plunge into Yellow Springs. That is Dogen's death poem. And for those of you that don't know, this is a centuries-old tradition, mostly in Japan and other Asian countries, where they write a poem just before they expire. Some great ones, too, about samurais just before they get their heads lopped off. And a footnote, Yellow Springs means Yomi, or Yomi no Kumi, which in Japanese stands for the land of the dead, the world of darkness. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, all you bodhisattvas. Remember, Sensei Ryodo would always start that way. I'm not trying to make any comparison, but we are bodhisattvas, whether we know it or not. So thank you for coming out on this Thursday evening, which is kind of a weird one with springtime. We've got a little thunder, I heard, some sprinkles. And we were supposed to be walking down the driveway. And we're behind schedule, as is often the case with remodels. And I was laughing with Sensei Koan a couple days ago. We were talking about the driveway and remembering that was my job many, many sessions ago to patch that driveway. We made some concrete up and we were kind of trying to straighten things out. And he went back further and he said he recollects Tenshin Roshi was there overseeing the work when the first driveway was put in with the flagstones. And now the work is being overseen by Faith Mind. I picked Dogen's death poem because I wanted to kind of peck a little away a little bit at this big topic, the great matter of death and dying. We Buddhists have kind of a reputation for being nihilists sometimes, depressingly, sometimes morbidly obsessed with these dark matters. Emptiness, death, and dying. We even have a birthday song that speaks to this. This is completely unrehearsed, but Carla, do you remember the words?
I sure do.
How does that go?
Pain and suffering in the air, people dying everywhere. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. But we come to this preoccupation honestly. Over 2,500 years ago, most of us know this story, a young prince named Siddhartha, which, by the way, means every wish fulfilled. He'd been sequestered in this beautiful palace in Kapilavatthu, and some of us have been there. Not me, but some of us. It's located in the Himalayan foothills of what we now call southern Nepal. His father was protecting him, surrounding him with luxury and beauty. And he was trying to protect him from the adversities of life. Why, you may ask? Well, there had been a wise sage before his birth, saying that your son, when he is born, would either be a great monarch, a secular leader, or a great religious leader. Dad wanted the former. So he kept him from seeing what was going on in the world behind the palace walls. Then, as it happens, the son had heard, Siddhartha had heard that there were some pretty cool things outside the gates. Dad finally acquiesced, let him go outside, but not without a lot of preparation, making sure the streets were all clean so he would only see beautiful things when he left. Well, one of the stories I read say the gods got involved with this. He was out with the driver, and he sees an old, white-haired, decrepit man. And he asks the driver, "Who is this creature?" The driver, again I'm told, his tongue loosened by the gods, said, "He's an old man. He too was once like you, and you too will grow old. You too will lose your strength and youth." He said it's the lot of every being. So, to speed the story up a bit, there are future excursions. And once again, he runs into two other signs of mortal afflictions. He sees a very sick person, and he sees a corpse. Old age, sickness, and death. He goes out one more time, and he observes this shaven head man and asks, after realizing that he's got this begging bowl, but still projecting this sense of tranquility, and he asks, "Who is that?" The driver tells him it's a monk. He has left worldly matters behind him and is seeking a higher good. And as we all know, this was the catalyst for Siddhartha to go on his spiritual journey after witnessing old age, sickness, and death, and then seeing that there may be a different way. There's another story. A young boy in a far-off land loses his father when he's 2 years old. 6 years later, he loses his mom. At her funeral, this newly orphaned boy stood in front of the altar looking at the incense which had been offered for his mother, sadly watching it disappear, watching the smoke disappear. And he was struck with this feeling about how fleeting life is. He also vowed to leave home, seek the meaning of life and death. And this, of course, was the story of Dogen Zenji, who was one of the founders of the Soto sect, our sect of Zen Buddhism, who traveled to China looking for a master, coming back and starting the Soto school. In more modern times, the Dalai Lama, I remember hearing, this was probably 15, 20 years ago, somebody was interviewing him and he said, was asked the question, "Do you have any regrets?" And he said, "Yes, I haven't worked enough on my own death." Rumor has it that he's made up for lost time. Now, in preparing for this, And there is a plethora of information out there on Buddhism and death and dying. And I went back as far as I could, and back to the oldest Buddhist text that I could find on Google, and went back to the Theravada school of Buddhism and their Pali canon. And those of you that don't know, there are two major schools of Buddhism, the Theravada and Mahayana. The Theravada preceded the Mahayana. So this Pali canon is considered some of the oldest Buddhist writings. It's divided into three sections. One is the Vinaya, and this is the disciplinary rules governing the monks. The Abhidhamma, which I'm told are the psychological writings which postdate the historical Buddha. And then the Suttas, which are supposed to be the Buddha's discourses, his actual words. And it's Sutta in Pali, and we know it as Sutra. They carry a lot of weight. I looked it up. It said they interpret this suttas of minimal syllabary, unambiguous, pithy, comprehensive, continuous, and without flaw. Who knows the sutra knows it be thus. So listen to what this sutta says, the Dhammapada. The first sentence is in quotes. Here shall I dwell in the seasons of rains, and here in winter and summer. End of quote. Thus thinks the fool, but he does not think of death. For death carries away the man whose mind is self-satisfied with his children and his flocks, even as a torrent carries away a sleeping village. Neither father, sons, nor one's relations can stop the king of death. When he comes with all his power, a man's relations cannot save him. A man who is virtuous and wise understands the meaning of this and swiftly strives with all his might to clear a path to nirvana. And also from the Pali Canon, I found the Buddha's 5 daily reflections. We Buddhists love lists. 3 treasures, 4 noble truths, the Eightfold Path, 12 precepts, and on and on. So these are the 5 daily reflections. And I found or thought it must be of some import if the Buddha had said he wanted you to reflect on these things every day. I am subject to aging. Aging is unavoidable. I am subject to illness. Illness is unavoidable. I am subject to death. Death is unavoidable. I will grow different, separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. And finally, I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, and live dependent on my actions. Whatever I do, for good or for ill, that will I fall heir. Of course, all of us have had our brushes, our experiences with old age, sickness, and death. And I would venture to say that some of us have actually found our way through these temple gates because of those experiences. I have found that experiencing the death of a loved one, witnessing the death of others, can be transformative in one's life. my own first experience, and some of you have heard this story 2 years ago, so I'll do the abbreviated version. This was during the practice talk, I think. Mary was there. I remember that. And you all probably remember the movie Night at the Museum. It's with Ben Stills, Robin Williams. I called this my Night at the Mortuary story. I was in college, first year in college, was pledging a class, pledging at fraternity. Decided kind of at the very end of the pledging process I didn't want to do that. That wasn't my calling. So I went into the administration hall for housing and found there an ad for a job at a mortuary, to live and work at a mortuary. So I said, that's pretty cool. So I took it. Keeping in mind, at that point, I'm a freshman in college. I have never been to a funeral. Nobody in my family at that time had passed. My great-grandmother lived to 102. We had like 5 generations alive at one time. So I hadn't experienced this at all. So I live at this mortuary. It's right out here in the valley, Glen Haven Valley Mortuary. And the first couple months, nothing really much happens. They do most of their work up in Sunland, Tahunga. They have a big cemetery up there, and that's where all the embalmers were and all the real work was happening. So the manager lived upstairs above me, and I was downstairs. First 2 months, nothing happens. It's quiet. I'm getting all this studying done. And then we get a call from the other mortuary asking me to do a pickup. We call it in the business a first call. So that's when you go pick up the deceased either at their home or hospital or wherever they might be. And so they asked me to go out to a hospital to pick up a body right out here in the San Fernando Valley. Ironically, it was the same hospital our first daughter was born in. So I go in. Well, the body ends up being that of a child. And they give me this box about yay big. So I put it in the hearse, the first call car, we call it. It's more of like wasn't a fancy like for funerals, more of a station wagon. Those of you that remember station wagon. So I go up to the other cemetery and mortuary. And I walk into their embalming room, carrying my little box. Well, there were about 6 bodies laid out on tables. One in particular stood out, had what I later found out was hydrocephalus. So he had this tiny body with this just huge, grotesque head. In one of the other rooms was a body of a woman completely open with sawdust in her cavity. She had come from County General, all jaundiced, yellow. I learned that she happened to be the same age as my mom was at that time. It felt pretty surreal. I went home to the other mortuary, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. You know, all the big questions. What is death? Who dies? And the realization that all of us end up on that table at one time or another. Impermanence. How do we really feel about our own mortality? Yeah, we can mentally or intellectually kind of grasp this, right? We all know we're going to die. Nobody makes it out of here alive. Buddha didn't. Jesus didn't. And we do this chant in the evenings. Life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunity is lost. Each of us should strive to awaken. Awaken. Take heed. Do not squander your life. But how many of us really kind of fritter our lives away? Hide our heads in the sand? Squander our lives? How many of us really practice as though there's a fire upon our head? Maybe we do at times. Why do you think that's so? And on a practical level, how many of us have really appropriately prepared for the inevitability of your own demise? I think it was over a decade ago, Roshi had run a class using Stephen Levine's book, A Year to Live. And the rest of the title is How to Live This Year as If It Were Your Last. And as the title suggests, this sets up a scenario that you've been given 1 year to live. And then you confront the processes that you would go through. And that's emotional, philosophical, spiritual, and the practical side of this whole process. A number of years ago, I took my Thursday night sitting group through the same process. And on what I call the legal night, I brought in one of my best friends, who's an attorney, Rich Carcel, to talk about the legal aspects of death and dying. Dharma Joy would be very proud of me. So we covered wills, trusts, the 5 wishes that we've studied here and hopefully filled out, healthcare directives, powers of attorney, charitable remainder trust, asking that they give the money to ZCLA. So Rich, to make his point, related horror story after horror story. I could go on for the rest of the hour and more with these stories. I won't, but there are a few that bear mentioning. These stories included things like looking for Jung Yuk of China. One of Rich's clients had taught in China for a while and then was back here, and apparently had really been taken by this Jung Yuk of China. So she bequeathed in her will $1,000 for Jung Yuk. No information other than that. No address. So the way it worked out is that legally, per the law, you have to do a diligent search, as he put it. So the trust spent $10,000 to not find Jung Yuk for his $1,000. Other stories include people that wanted to be cremated but were buried, people that were buried and wanted to be cremated because they hadn't done their homework. One also stood out that the children bought this exorbitant casket that had silk-lined pockets on the inside so you could write notes to put in with your loved ones so they could carry those off into the hereafter. Mom had wanted that money to go into an educational fund for the kids. And it gets worse. There was a daughter who was actually living in her mother's house. And the mother had intended for her to have the house and stay in the house. But of course, this didn't get documented properly. It's in probate. And so what happens is she gets evicted out of the house because there are other siblings. And as an asset, it had to be liquidated and split 3 ways. And of course, the saddest stories are just families that have had good relationships, loving relationships, and they're just ripped apart into warring factions. So he goes on and on and on. He's seen it all. So, the encouragement is, get prepared, folks. It's going to happen. And you know, when you do it, you feel better. Most of us can remember being in finals week where you're supposed to be studying and you go out and play instead. And somehow that play isn't really great because you have that cloud hanging over your head. Now, I'm a very slow learner. You can ask Roshi. It takes a lot to get things through this thick skull. I'm sure that I hold the record here at ZCLA for the longest amount of time to pass a first koan. So, my one little brush with death in the mortuary didn't send me off to China or on a wild spiritual journey. So now, living in a mortuary wasn't enough. So fate or some karmic twist has brought me into hospice work, which I've been doing since, I volunteered for a number of years, but actually been working as a chaplain there since October. So here I am, face to face with old age, death, and dying every day. It's right in my face. And you know, I love the work. It is really sacred work. Other than being a Zen priest, it's one of the best jobs in the world. It reminded me of a story that our Roshi, told about Maizumi Roshi. And they had a monk that was here but not really active, but who was very, very ill, and he was in the hospital. So Roshi Yoku borrowed Maizumi Roshi's car and went to see this monk in the hospital. And she returned, and then when she was bringing the keys back to Maizumi Roshi, he asked, well, how's he doing? She said, not too well. He's not doing well at all. And she asked if he might not want to go see him. He replied, not me. I want a live one. Do you understand? Do you hear me? I understand that. I get that. But I also understand the power of hospice work. Lori Adolph is a friend of mine who runs the supportive care services at the prison where I serve. I do some volunteer work up there with a Buddhist group on Wednesday nights. But I work with Lori on Friday mornings from 8 to noon. And she runs the hospice program at the prison. In fact, we're graduating another class of inmates as hospice workers this Friday, and I get to go do a little speech up there on Monday. And Lori has in her office a plaque, and it reads, "The dying are our best teachers." And I think that certainly can be the truth. Now, I want to give Maizumi Roshi credit too, because our Roshi did say there were times where he was actually holding people as they expired. So he wasn't completely immune from all that. So I bear witness to all of this. And sometimes I ask, what am I really bearing witness to? And I remember Roshi Bernie was here not long ago during a workshop. And he was talking about the street retreats. And he made the distinction that when they were on these retreats, that they weren't bearing witness to homelessness. Because they weren't homeless. After the retreat was over, you get to go home. What they were doing is bearing witness to living on the streets. And I feel kind of the same way, or after a time, felt the same way. At first I said, well, I'm bearing witness to dying. Well, of course we're all dying, but it's not imminent in my case. After I've been with somebody that is dying, I get to go home. So, we're kind of bearing witness to those that are dying. So on each visit, I embrace the three tenets that we've learned here for so many years: the not knowing, bearing witness, and loving action. And you never know what's going to happen with each patient, with each visit. You just show up. No expectations, no agenda, no judgments. And you bear witness. And sometimes it's pretty tough. You're bearing witness to a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. Sometimes it's been beyond my wildest imagination. People struggling physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Other times it's somebody who's really got it together, a peaceful soul that has kind of worked through all of this. Other times it's to a non-responsive person. Somebody, as we say, who is imminent. Lying in a hospital bed, mouth open, completely unresponsive, just before they're passing. We get calls from the nurses with all the patients. They'll say, somebody is transitioning, meaning they're getting close. Imminent, they're really close. Get out and see them. We have a lot of talk about a good death. You know, what's a good death? When I was working with Alzheimer's patients, there was a consultant, and he used to say, when you met one person with Alzheimer's, you've met one person with Alzheimer's. They're all different. And the same thing could be said of those that are dying. So of course, I've only been doing this really less than a year. Stephen Levine, who's one of my big heroes, has been doing this 20 plus years. Joan Halifax, like a lot of these people have been doing this a long time. And we hold that people who often can make this journey from a tragedy to a transformation. Healing is always possible. Doesn't always happen, but it is possible. And there's another gentleman, Frank, and I'm not really sure of the pronunciation of his name. Ostaseki? I don't know if anybody knows him. I think that may be how you do it. He's the founding director of the Zen Hospice Project. And I like what he has to say. He says that this involves three elements: this possibility of transformation, presence, compassionate companionship, and supportive inquiry with the patients. He goes on to say that at Zen Hospice we say there is no real service unless both people, those who are cared for and the caregiver, are being served. So when I'm working with somebody who's dying, I'm working on myself as well. I get to watch my own mind, noticing how my own heart opens sometimes, closes at others. I become aware of my own grief and my own fear surrounding death. And in this way begin to kind of understand this other person's suffering is also my suffering. Now, as a chaplain, we come to support whatever the faith tradition is for the patient. So do a lot of stuff. Do a lot of biblical passages for Catholics, Methodists, Lutherans, Protestants, Jews. I found that atheists are sometimes some of the most spiritual people I've ever known. And there's actually the occasional person of a Buddhist persuasion, actually more than I thought. And then get to do all this meditation, Tonglen meditation, death meditations, following the breath, and on, and speak of things that I'm a little more familiar with. The biggest bonus is I get to recite poetry all the time, read poetry, recite poetry. My Mary Oliver books, of which I have many, are all torn and tattered. And we're there not to proselytize or convert anybody. We're there to provide what's called pastoral support and reassurance. Some people just want the company. They don't want to be alone. Sometimes they want somebody to listen to them. Sometimes we're just in there holding their hand. One patient that I adored just wanted me to sit there and watch NCIS episodes on TV with him. They can decline spiritual counseling, and this one particular lady, she was a strong Methodist, had a strong faith, said, I don't need this. Bright lady, had written books, and she said, I am so well supported by my church group, it's okay. Thank you. That's fine. About a week later, I get a call from the nurse, the hospice nurse that's working with her, and she said, she's decided that she doesn't want all her Methodist congregation to know she's on hospice and start to feel sorry for her. And so she said she has some spiritual questions, and she wanted to talk to me about them. And as it turned out, I was on the phone with her, and she said she'd read a book that was highly recommended by a lot of her Methodist friends. She read it, wasn't sure about some of it. It was called Proof of Heaven by Eben Alexander. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may scoff at it. Eben is a neurosurgeon who had a near-death experience. He had meningitis, which affected his brain, and basically was in a coma for 7 days. As I understand it, on the 7th day, he had a 2% chance of coming out of that alive. But this is a guy that is steeped in science. He was on staff at Harvard, a neurosurgeon, had done many, many surgeries. I actually found out it was on the New York, or is on the New York Times bestseller list. She asked if I'd read it. I said no. I said, but I'd love to read it, and then we can get together. So that's what we did. So what I was expecting when I got the book was something very Christian, with a lot of biblical passages. And what I found was really something quite different. Even a lot of times they'll put quotes right in the chapter, the head of the chapter. Not nary a Christian one at all. It was all scientists and writers and philosophers. So it's quite interesting. Einstein, for example, and he wrote something I love. The true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained liberation from the self. Doesn't that sound familiar? He also said in another chapter heading, there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other as if everything is. But he's got Soren Kierkegaard in there, Herman Melville, Rene Descartes. Descartes says, if you would be a real seeker after truth, it is necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things. I think that also rings very familiar. Great faith, great doubt, great perseverance. What also struck me in the book were the similarities that he experienced in his near-death experience. The similarities with the Tibetan Book of the Dead and in their Bardo period, and that's the period between death and rebirth. The Tibetans are real famous for going into tremendous detail about this. He's not quite as detailed, but he goes into some of the very same things. This one dark realm where he has these grotesque monster faces coming up at him. And then he sees beatific beings in a more heavenly realm. And I wanted to share a paragraph that really struck me. See if you can relate to it from Buddhism. Seeing and hearing were not separate in this place. And this is what he calls the core. Seeing and hearing were not separate in this place where I now was. I could hear the visual beauty of the silvery bodies of those scintillating beings above. And I could see the surging, joyful perfection of what they sang. It seemed that you could not look at or listen to anything in this world without becoming a part of it, without joining with it in some mysterious way. Again, from my perspective, I would suggest that you couldn't look at anything in that world at all, for the word "at" itself implies a separation that did not exist there. Everything was distinct, yet everything was also a part of everything else, like the rich and intermingled designs on a Persian carpet or a butterfly's wing. And my words, or Indra's net. So how Buddhist is that? That was the book, and then I was intrigued enough to kind of follow up. He made it to Oprah, the Oprah show, right? So you've got to be a success, and it must be true, of course, if you made it to Oprah. So she has this really intriguing interview with Eben, and he says more than what he said in the book. He claims to say that you can experience what he experienced without having a near-death experience, without dying, through deep meditation or centering prayer, he said. He talks about turning off the little voice in the head. And he reports in that interview that he now meditates a couple hours a day. This guy's an Episcopalian, Christian. He goes on also to say that his experience was not about any one religion, and makes another comment: the boundaries of self are fiction. Isn't that interesting? He also says on the show, I guess, as he first comes out, and it takes him a couple months to kind of get back to normal. I mean, he's back doing surgery and everything as we speak. But as he first came out, he looked up to the family members that were present, and he says, "All is well." And then in this Oprah interview, goes on to say that his daughter had said, when she first saw him, that he looked like a little Buddha. So I found that it's important to offer this spiritual support, remembering that even when there's no chance in curing a disease, that there is a chance for healing. And the distinction it's an important one. Healing, as I looked it up, is the same root as wholeness, meaning not broken or damaged. So in healing, we rediscover our intrinsic wholeness. We've had it all along. Doesn't that sound like what Roshi and the teachers tell us? I've witnessed some pretty remarkable transformations already. But as I've mentioned, Steve Levine has done this for a long time. And a book that I just have been reading that he wrote is called Healing into Life and Death. So he's talking about healing. Sometimes these people come out of cancer. They go into remission. They have a healing where they physically are healed. Other times not so, but he calls it a healing into death. And I want to share that. So we do have enough time for me to share this little story from the book. We were working with Hazel, a woman who had come into the hospital in a very contracted state. She was a very difficult patient. The nurses called her a real bitch on wheels. Few wished to spend time with her. Hazel's physicians and attendants said that whenever she rang the bell, they were greeted with nasty comments and considerable verbal abuse. And so, of course, every time she rang the bell, it took a little longer to be answered. All her life, she had been in a struggle for control. Seldom had she just let life be. All that she didn't want or could not have was judged and pushed away from her heart. All that she could get was grasped at feverishly. And so she found herself dying alone, in a great deal of pain. She had judged so many, so often, that even her own grown children would not visit. She was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of anger and despair. For 6 weeks, her isolation and pain increased until one night, something changed. She came to a point where she could no longer stand the suffering in her back and legs or the pain of her unlived life. At 4 a.m., feeling like jumping out of her skin, she began to review her life amidst the pulsations of her pain. Never had it been so clear how her intense holding had created such intense pain, such a sense of desolation and aloneness. She saw how the considerable suffering she had caused during her lifetime had come back to her at her own death time. She had nowhere to turn. She had never felt more alone or helpless. Feeling death approach, she remembered herself as a youngster, open and hungry for the world. She saw how she had closed down over the years. With a deep sigh, she let the helplessness wash over her, and, exhausted, unable to fight another moment, she surrendered. She let go and died into her life, into the moment. Letting go into the pain in her spine and legs, she began to sense, quite beyond reason, that she was somehow not alone in her suffering. She felt what she later called the 10,000 in pain. She began to experience all the other beings who at that very moment were lying in that same bed of agony. At first there arose the experience of herself as a brown-skinned woman, breasts slack from malnutrition, lying on her side, a starving child suckling at her empty breasts, spine and leg twisted in pain, the musculature contracted from starvation and disease. For an instant she became this Ethiopian woman with the same pain in the back and legs and hips, lying on her side, dying in the mud. Then there arose the experience of an Eskimo woman lying on her side, dying during childbirth. Tremendous pain in her back, hips, legs, and dying the same death. Then her experience became that of the body of a woman in a twisted car wreckage, her back and legs broken, slowly dying alone by the side of a deserted road. Image after image arose of the 10,000 in pain. She was dying beside the others. She experienced the 10,000 suffering simultaneously. In the hour of her greatest agony, something in her connected with the enormity of the suffering she was sharing at that moment. The pain was beyond my bearing. I couldn't stand it any longer, and something broke. Maybe it was my heart. But I saw it wasn't just my pain. It was the pain. It wasn't just my life. It was all life. It was life itself. As the days unfolded after this extraordinary experience, Hazel's heart opened more and more to all the others in pain in the hospitals where she stayed. She constantly asked after them. As the weeks went by, she continued to get a deeper sense of what she had participated in. She went beyond herself, and the room became a place where the nurses would come on their break because it was a room of love. Soon her children came to visit because of the warmth and surrender of her phone calls, responding to her plea for forgiveness. Her grandchildren sitting on the edge of her bed, the grandchildren she had never met, the hearts she had rejected before they were born. Her room became a place of healing, of finished business, of universal care. Some weeks later, a few days before she died, someone brought her a picture of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, lovingly surrounded by children and animals. And this woman, whose life had been one of such hardness and isolation, looked at the picture and said, with her voice cracking, "Oh, Jesus, have mercy on them. Forgive them. They are only children." And as Stephen Levine said, it was one of the most remarkable healings that he and his wife had ever seen. I'm working actually with a woman very much like this right now. She's only 40-some years old, end-stage breast cancer. She has been so hard and so difficult to work with. But I can see now a softening of her heart that's occurring. She's an unfinished story. So once again, some of this preoccupation is perceived as negative and nihilistic, but I don't think it's really so. I think there's a real freedom that comes with this exploration, or there can be a real healing and reconciliation. But why wait till you're on your deathbed? This work can be done now. And as my Zumi Roshi had said, I want a live one. Do you hear me? And we have to end with a Mary Oliver poem. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measlepox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each flower, each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say, all my life I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world. Questions? Comments? Really want to just get out of here. "54 years lighting up the sky. A quivering leap smashes a billion worlds. Ha! Entire body looks for nothing. Living, I plunge into yellow springs."